My blood turned to ice as my wife's father sneered street garbage in a borrowed suit across the silent dining table. The billionaire's cruel eyes locked with mine, savoring my public humiliation. 23 elite guests held their breath, witnessing my destruction. I rose slowly, heart pounding, a smile forming on my lips. Empires fall with a whisper. You know what they say about playing with fire? Well, turns out I'm the kind of idiot who walks straight into the flames with a smile and a gas can. But let me back up and paint you the picture of how one dinner party turned into the most expensive mistake Richard Whitmore ever made in his pathetic, privileged life. The Whitmore estate. And yeah, they actually call it an estate, like we're living in some Jane Austen fever dream. Sprawled across 23 acres of Connecticut countryside like a monument to everything wrong with old money. I'm talking about the kind of place where the driveway alone probably cost more than most people's houses, complete with those pretentious stone lions that seemed to sneer at anyone who wasn't born with a trust fund surgically attached to their spine. Walking into that dining room was like stepping into a museum exhibit titled, "How the Other Half Hoards Their Cash." Crystal chandeliers hung overhead like frozen fireworks, each one probably worth more than my first car, my second car, and hell, maybe my third car combined. The walls were lined with oil paintings of dead Whitmores who looked exactly as thrilled to be there as I felt, which is to say, they all had that special expression of someone who'd rather be getting a root canal without anesthesia. The dining table stretched out like an airport runway, polished mahogany so shiny I could see my reflection staring back at me, looking about as comfortable as a cat in a dog park. 23 placed settings of bone china that probably had its own insurance policy, each fork and knife positioned with the kind of military precision that would make a drill sergeant weep with joy. And there I sat, trying not to accidentally destroy something that cost more than my college education. The guest list read like a who's who of Connecticut's financial elite: senators, hedge fund managers, oil executives, and various other people who'd never had to check their bank balance before buying groceries. They all had that same look, you know? That special blend of boredom and superiority that comes from never having to worry about anything more pressing than which yacht to take to the Hamptons. I'd been to these little soirees before, courtesy of being married to Clara, and let me tell you, they were about as much fun as a tax audit performed by sadistic accountants. Every conversation felt like walking through a minefield where one wrong word about your background, your politics, or God forbid, your net worth, could blow up in your face faster than you could say nouveau riche. But this particular evening, something felt different. Maybe it was the way Richard kept shooting me those looks across the table. You know the kind. The ones that could freeze hell over and make Satan himself reach for a sweater. Maybe it was how he'd made sure to seat me at the far end of the table, as far from Clara as possible, like I was some kind of social disease that might spread if I got too close to the good china. Richard Whitmore sat at the head of the table like some kind of financial pharaoh, surveying his kingdom of sycophants and yes-men. The guy was pushing 70, but had the kind of presence that filled a room and sucked all the oxygen out of it at the same time. Silver hair slicked back with what I assumed was the tears of small business owners, a suit that probably cost more than most people's wedding, and eyes that could appraise your net worth faster than a computer algorithm. Throughout dinner, he held court like some medieval lord, regaling his captive audience with stories about hostile takeovers, market manipulation that somehow wasn't technically illegal, and various other ways he'd stepped on people's dreams to build his empire. The guests laughed at all the right moments, nodded with practiced enthusiasm, and generally acted like Richard was dispensing wisdom instead of bragging about being a professional sociopath. I played the part I'd been assigned, the quiet husband, the tolerated addition to the family, the guy who should be grateful just to breathe the same rarefied air as his betters. I made small talk about the weather, complimented the wine, and generally tried to be as invisible as possible. But inside, every scrape of silver against porcelain sounded like nails on a chalkboard, every forced laugh felt like a slap in the face, and every sideways glance reminded me exactly what these people thought of me. The evening was winding down, coffee and brandy making their rounds, when Richard decided to drop his little bomb. He leaned back in his chair with the casual confidence of a man who'd never faced consequences for his actions, looked directly at me with those cold, calculating eyes, and delivered his verdict like a judge passing sentence. Street garbage in a borrowed suit. The words hit the room like a physical force. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Wine glasses froze halfway to lips. Even the staff, who'd been moving around the room like ghosts, suddenly became statues. 23 of Connecticut's most powerful people sat there like they'd just witnessed a car crash, equal parts horrified and fascinated. But here's the thing about being called garbage by a man who inherited everything he had. It's like being criticized for your table manners by someone who eats with their feet. The insult was supposed to destroy me, humiliate me, put me in my place, and remind everyone present about the natural order of things. Instead, it did something else entirely. It woke something up inside me that had been sleeping for too long. I felt my blood turn to ice water, but not from fear or shame. From clarity. Pure, crystalline clarity about exactly what needed to happen next. Because Richard Whitmore had just made the classic mistake of every bully throughout history. He'd assumed his target would stay down after the first punch. I rose slowly from my chair, taking my time, letting every second stretch out like taffy. The smile that spread across my face wasn't the polite, practiced expression I'd worn all evening. This was something different entirely, the kind of smile that would have made a shark nervous. Because in that moment, humiliation transformed into something much more dangerous. Fuel for the fire that was about to consume everything Richard Whitmore thought he owned. Empires fall with a whisper, I thought, still smiling as I looked around the room at all those frozen faces. And brother, was I about to whisper? You ever watch someone you love get caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't start? It's like watching a car crash in slow motion. Except the car is your heart, and the crash is happening over and over again until you're not sure what hurts more, the original impact or watching the wreckage burn. I'd barely made it halfway down the circular driveway when I heard her heels clicking against the stone like some kind of desperate Morse code. The sound echoed off the mansion's walls, bouncing around all that expensive architecture like a pinball machine designed by someone with seriously twisted priorities. Behind me, the Whitmore estate loomed like a medieval fortress, every window glowing with warm light that somehow managed to feel cold as hell. My Lexus. And yeah, I called it modest earlier because when you're parked next to a fleet of Bentleys, Maseratis, and whatever the hell else these people drive to compensate for their emotional inadequacies, a Lexus might as well be a Honda Civic, sat there like a faithful dog waiting for its owner to stop making terrible life decisions. The valet had parked it with the kind of careful disdain usually reserved for handling someone else's dirty laundry. Wait. Please, just wait. Clara's voice cut through the Connecticut night air like a knife through butter, except butter doesn't usually sound like it's been crying for the past 10 minutes. I stopped with my hand on the door handle, not because I was having second thoughts about leaving, but because 20 years of loving someone doesn't just evaporate because her old man decided to show his ass at a dinner party. Even when that ass showing involved publicly calling you street garbage in front of half the financial elite of the Northeast. She caught up to me just as I was deciding between driving away like a mature adult or going back inside to show Richard exactly what kind of damage street garbage could do when properly motivated. Clara looked like she'd been through a blender, mascara doing its best impression of abstract art down her cheeks, that perfect blonde hair that usually looked like she'd just stepped out of a magazine shoot, now hanging around her face like defeated curtains. The dress she'd worn to impress Daddy's friends, some designer number that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, now seemed to hang on her like she was wearing someone else's life. But even looking like she'd gone 12 rounds with the emotional heavyweight champion, she was still the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Which, let me tell you, made what came next about as easy as performing surgery with oven mitts. I'm so sorry, she whispered, and the words came out broken, like she was trying to apologize for every terrible thing that had ever happened in the history of human civilization. Her hands were shaking, not the delicate flutter you see in movies, but the real deal, the kind of trembling that comes from watching your two worlds collide and realizing there's no way both of them survive intact. She reached for me like I was her lifeline, fingers gripping my jacket with the desperation of someone trying to hold on to something that's already slipping away. He didn't mean it. He's been under so much pressure lately with the markets and the merger talks and... Clara. I said her name like a period at the end of a sentence, cutting through her stream of excuses and justifications before they could pick up steam. Because that's what they were, excuses. We both knew it, even if she wasn't ready to admit it yet. No, listen to me, she pressed on, because Clara Whitmore had never met a lost cause she wouldn't try to save, including her bastard of a father. He drinks too much at these things. You know how he gets when he's had wine and he's trying to show off for his friends. It doesn't mean anything. Oh, but see, that's where she was wrong. Dead wrong. It meant everything. I could see the war happening inside her head. Loyalty to blood versus loyalty to love. Family legacy versus building something new. The comfortable cage of inherited wealth versus the uncertain freedom of choosing your own path. It was like watching someone trying to solve a math equation where every possible answer somehow came out wrong. The thing about growing up rich is that it gives you a certain kind of blindness. You start to believe that money can fix anything, smooth over any rough edges, make any problem disappear if you throw enough cash at it. Clara had lived her whole life watching her father write checks to make uncomfortable truths go away. So naturally she assumed this was just another invoice waiting to be paid. But this wasn't about money. This was about respect, about basic human dignity, about the fact that her father had looked at me across his fancy dining room table and decided I was something to be scraped off the bottom of his Italian leather shoes. He called me garbage, Clara. I kept my voice steady, not because I was calm, but because she needed to hear this without the distraction of anger or hurt feelings. In front of 23 people. In front of senators and CEOs and God knows who else. He looked me in the eye and called me street garbage in a borrowed suit. She flinched like I'd slapped her, because hearing it said back to her made it real in a way that watching it happen hadn't quite managed. Sometimes you need to hear your own reality spoken out loud before you can really understand how screwed up it is. I know, but nothing. I reached up and touched her face, wiping away tears that kept coming like a broken faucet. This isn't the first insult, baby. This is just the first one, he said out loud. And there it was, the truth we'd both been dancing around for 3 years of marriage. Every snide comment about my background, every pointed question about how I'd really made my money, every time he'd introduced me as Clara's husband, instead of using my actual name. Death by 1,000 cuts, except tonight he'd finally pulled out the machete. The worst part? Clara knew I was right. I could see it in her eyes, the way they went wide and a little bit helpless, like she was finally connecting dots she'd been trying real hard not to see. Because admitting that meant admitting she'd been enabling it, making excuses for it, pretending it was something she could manage or control. I love you, she whispered, and it sounded like a prayer and an apology all rolled into one. I love you so much, and I'm sorry I let him. I'm sorry I didn't. I pulled her into my arms right there in the driveway, under the glow of those pretentious fucking lanterns that probably cost more than some people's cars. She felt small against me, smaller than usual, like watching her father destroy her husband had somehow diminished her too. I know you do, I said into her hair, which smelled like expensive shampoo and regret. And I love you too, more than anything. But love, as it turns out, doesn't always trump family loyalty. And family loyalty, no matter how misguided, doesn't always trump the need for justice. I kissed her forehead gently, the way you might kiss something precious that you're afraid might break if you're not careful enough. I'll call you tomorrow, okay? She nodded against my chest, but I could feel her reluctance in every fiber of her body. She knew something was ending here, even if she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. What she didn't understand, what she couldn't understand, because she'd never been poor or desperate or humiliated in front of people whose respect you actually needed, was that tomorrow wasn't just another day. Tomorrow was the beginning of a war her father had declared without even realizing it. I got in my car and started the engine, watching in the rearview mirror as Clara stood there in the driveway, getting smaller and smaller as I drove away. The massive Whitmore estate towered behind her like some kind of Gothic monument to inherited arrogance. And for the first time since I'd married into this family, I realized that maybe the cage had never been meant for me at all. Maybe it had been built for her. You know what's beautiful about living in the digital age? Revenge can be served faster than a McDonald's drive-through order, and twice as satisfying. By the time I'd made it halfway back to my penthouse in Manhattan, my phone was buzzing like an angry wasp trapped in a mason jar. 3 missed calls from Marcus Rivera, my right-hand man, and the only person on earth who could talk me out of doing something spectacularly stupid, which, let's be honest, made tonight's phone call particularly interesting. Marcus had been with me since the early days of Crosspoint Innovations, back when we were operating out of a cramped office space that smelled like burnt coffee and broken dreams. The guy was brilliant, MBA from Wharton, strategic mind like a chess grandmaster, and the kind of loyalty you can't buy even if you're throwing around Whitmore-level cash. He was also the closest thing I had to a conscience, which meant he was about to hate what I was planning to do. I pulled over at a rest stop somewhere between Connecticut and Sanity, the kind of fluorescent-lit purgatory where truckers grab coffee that could strip paint and teenagers make life-altering mistakes in the back seat of their parents' cars. The parking lot was mostly empty except for a few semis and what looked like someone's midlife crisis masquerading as a red sports car. The phone rang twice before Marcus picked up, and I could already hear the concern in his voice. "Boss, everything okay?" You left 3 messages that were just heavy breathing and what sounded like classical music. "The deal's off," I said without preamble, because sometimes the best way to deliver bad news is like ripping off a Band-Aid. Fast, clean, and before anyone has time to talk you out of it. Silence. The kind of silence that comes right before someone either starts laughing or starts screaming. With Marcus, it was always a coin flip. "I'm sorry, what now?" His voice had that careful quality people use when they're talking to someone who might be having a mental breakdown. "Which deal?" Because if you're talking about the Peterson account, I already told you that guy's a flake, but if you're talking about Whitmore Holdings, the merger, all of it, done, finished, canceled with a capital C and a side of go fuck yourself. More silence. Then I heard what sounded like Marcus dropping something heavy, followed by some creative Spanish cursing that would have made his grandmother wash his mouth out with soap. "Are you out of your goddamn mind?" There it was, the screaming option. We're talking about $2 billion here. $2 billion. With AB. As in, holy shit, we'll never see this kind of money again in our lifetimes. I leaned back against my car and watched a family of raccoons conduct what appeared to be a hostile takeover of a garbage bin. Even in the animal kingdom, everything came down to power and territory. Richard Whitmore called me street garbage tonight, in front of half the financial elite of Connecticut. So no, the deal doesn't stand. He what? Marcus's voice shifted from panic to something else entirely. The guy had grown up in the Bronx before clawing his way to the top of the corporate food chain, so he understood better than most what it meant to be written off because of where you came from. "You heard me. Street garbage in a borrowed suit." Direct quote. While I was sitting at his table, eating his food, married to his daughter, the man looked me in the eye and decided I was something he'd scrape off his Italian leather shoes. Jesus Christ. I could hear Marcus pacing now, probably wearing a hole in the hardwood floors of his apartment while he tried to process this information. Okay, I get it. The guy's a world-class asshole. But think about this rationally for a second. We've got contracts signed, financing in place, lawyers who've been working on this for 6 months. The penalty clauses alone are going to cost us. I don't give a shit about penalty clauses. And I meant it. Sometimes you reach a point where the cost of keeping your dignity is worth more than any amount of money some spreadsheet says you're going to lose. He wants to play games? Fine. But he's about to learn that some games have consequences he didn't see coming. Marcus made that noise he always made when he was trying to figure out if I was being brilliant or insane. Kind of like a deflating balloon mixed with existential dread. Look, I know you're pissed. I would be too. But walking away from this deal isn't just about us. We've got employees, shareholders, people who are counting on. Marcus. I cut him off before he could really get rolling with the guilt trip. Do you remember what you told me when we started this company? Which time? I've told you a lot of things over the years, most of which you've ignored. You said that respect isn't something you can buy or negotiate. You either earn it or you demand it. And if someone refuses to give it to you, you make sure they understand the cost of that decision. Another pause. Then Marcus sighed like a man who'd just watched his retirement fund spontaneously combust. All right, but when the lawyers start calling tomorrow asking why we're torching a $2 billion merger over hurt feelings, I'm forwarding all those calls directly to you. Fair enough. But Marcus? Make sure the termination notice gets delivered first thing in the morning. I want Richard to wake up to the news that his golden goose just flew the coop. You're really going to do this? Already done it. I'm just asking you to make it official. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically hear the wheels turning in his head. The guy was probably running calculations, trying to figure out if there was any way to salvage this situation without completely destroying our relationship with one of the biggest holding companies on the East Coast. You know what this means, right? He finally said. Whitmore Holdings isn't just going to roll over and take this. Richard's got connections everywhere: banking, media, government. He could make things very difficult for us. I smiled, even though Marcus couldn't see it. Let him try. The thing about bullies is that they're used to people backing down. They build their whole worldview around the assumption that everyone else is as afraid of consequences as they should be. And you're not afraid of consequences? Terrified of them. But I'm more afraid of what happens if I let this slide. Because if I let Richard Whitmore call me garbage without any pushback, then I might as well hang a sign around my neck that says, "Please wipe your feet on me." Marcus made that deflating balloon noise again. Okay, I'll draft the termination notice tonight and have it delivered first thing tomorrow morning. But I'm also going to start making some calls. See if we can line up some alternative partnerships before word gets out that we've gone nuclear on the Whitmores. Good thinking. And Marcus? Make sure the language in that termination notice is as polite and professional as possible. I wanted to hurt, but I wanted to hurt quietly. No need to give Richard any ammunition to claim we're the unreasonable ones here. Got it. Anything else? Or can I go have that nervous breakdown I've been putting off? One more thing. I want you to leak the story to Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal. Nothing inflammatory, just the basic facts. Crosspoint Innovations has terminated its merger agreement with Whitmore Holdings due to irreconcilable differences regarding corporate culture and leadership philosophy. Corporate culture and leadership philosophy, Marcus repeated slowly. That's your way of saying, because their CEO is a raging dickhead, isn't it? It's my way of saying that without actually saying it. Let the financial press connect the dots. They love this kind of drama, and Richard's made enough enemies over the years that people will be lining up to speculate about what really happened. You're enjoying this. Damn right I am. For the first time in 3 years of being treated like Clara's charity case, I get to remind Richard Whitmore that some people can't be bought, bullied, or brushed aside. Tomorrow morning, he's going to wake up and discover that his $2 billion safety net just got pulled out from under him. I could hear Marcus typing in the background, probably already drafting the termination notice. You know what? Screw it. After what that bastard said to you tonight, he deserves whatever's coming to him. Now you're getting it. The king is about to bleed, and the best part is, his own arrogance handed me the knife. After I hung up, I sat in that parking lot for another few minutes, watching those raccoons finish their hostile takeover. Sometimes the smallest creatures cause the biggest disruptions, especially when everyone assumes they're not worth paying attention to. Tomorrow was going to be a very interesting day in the Whitmore household. There's something about driving through Manhattan at midnight that makes you feel like you're navigating through the arteries of some massive, sleepless beast. The city never really shuts down. It just shifts into a different gear, trading the frantic energy of rush hour for the slower, more deliberate pulse of late-night delivery trucks, taxicabs prowling for fares, and the occasional drunk businessman trying to hail a ride home to his wife and his guilty conscience. My penthouse sat 43 floors above the chaos, in one of those glass towers that architects design when they want to prove that money can literally elevate you above the problems of ordinary people. The irony wasn't lost on me. A kid who used to sleep on shelter floors now lived in the clouds, looking down on a city that had tried its damnedest to crush him underfoot. The elevator ride up felt longer than usual tonight, maybe because I had 43 floors worth of time to think about what I'd just set in motion. The reflection in the polished steel doors showed a man in an expensive suit who looked tired, pissed off, and oddly satisfied all at the same time. Not a bad combination, all things considered. My place was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd crawled up from nothing and wanted to make damn sure everyone knew he'd arrived. All clean lines, floor-to-ceiling windows, and furniture that cost more than most people's cars. The kind of space that screamed success so loudly it probably violated noise ordinances in 3 different boroughs. But tonight, surrounded by all that expensive shit, all I could think about was how far I'd traveled to get here. And not just the geographical distance from the Bronx to Manhattan. I'm talking about the kind of journey that leaves scars on your soul and teaches you lessons you can't learn in any business school. I poured myself 3 fingers of whiskey, the good stuff, the kind that costs as much per bottle as I used to make in a month, and settled into the chair by the window that looked out over Central Park. From up here, the park looked like a dark hole in the middle of the city's light show, a reminder that even in the most artificial environment on Earth, nature finds a way to carve out its own space. The memories came flooding back like water through a broken dam, which I guess was inevitable. You can't spend years building walls around your past without expecting them to crack under pressure occasionally, and tonight had definitely qualified as pressure. I remembered being 12 years old, standing in line at a food bank in the Bronx with my mom, both of us pretending we weren't embarrassed as hell to be there. Mom had lost her job at the textile factory when they moved production overseas, another casualty of corporate efficiency and quarterly profit reports. She'd held it together pretty well for the first few months, burning through her savings and picking up whatever part-time work she could find, but eventually reality caught up with good intentions. The people who ran the food bank were nice enough, I'll give them that. They handed out canned goods and day-old bread with the kind of practiced compassion that comes from seeing the same desperate faces week after week. But there's something soul-crushing about having to depend on charity, something that eats away at your sense of self-worth one free meal at a time. The worst part wasn't the hunger. Hell, kids are resilient, and I got used to going to bed with my stomach making protest sounds. The worst part was the way people looked at you when they found out you were one of those families. Teachers who suddenly spoke to you in that careful, patronizing tone usually reserved for injured animals. Classmates who stopped inviting you to birthday parties because their parents didn't want their kids associating with that element. By the time I was 14, Mom had found steady work again. 2 jobs, actually, because one job with benefits was apparently too much to ask for in the greatest country on earth. She cleaned office buildings downtown from midnight to 8 in the morning, then came home, grabbed a few hours of sleep, and headed to her afternoon gig at a dry cleaner that smelled like chemicals and broken dreams. I learned to take care of myself pretty early on. Made my own meals, did my own laundry, forged Mom's signature on report cards because she was always too tired to deal with school bureaucracy. Not complaining, just stating facts. When you grow up fast, you learn that the world doesn't give a damn about your sob story. It only cares about what you can produce, what you can contribute, what you're worth in dollars and cents. High school was where I discovered I had a brain that worked differently than most people's. While my classmates were struggling with basic algebra, I was teaching myself calculus from library books. While they were worried about who was dating who, I was reading everything I could get my hands on about business, economics, technology, anything that might help me claw my way up from the bottom of the food chain. The guidance counselor, a well-meaning woman who drove a car worth more than my mom made in 6 months, kept pushing me toward realistic career options. Community college, maybe a trade school, something practical for someone from my background. The subtext was clear. Know your place, stay in your lane, don't reach for things that aren't meant for people like you. But here's what people like that guidance counselor never understood. When you've got nothing to lose, you can take risks that would terrify someone who's always had a safety net. When failure means going back to where you already were, failure becomes a lot less scary than it is for people who've never experienced real desperation. College was 4 years of working 3 jobs while maintaining a 4.0 GPA, because anything less than perfection wasn't going to cut it for someone with my zip code. I slept maybe 4 hours a night, lived on ramen noodles and whatever free food I could scrounge from campus events, and learned that there are 2 kinds of tired. The kind that comes from physical exhaustion, and the kind that comes from constantly having to prove you deserve to be somewhere. The rich kids, and there were plenty of them, treated college like some kind of 4-year vacation with occasional homework breaks. They joined fraternities, went on spring break trips that cost more than my annual tuition, and generally acted like the world owed them success just for showing up. Meanwhile, I was in the library at 2 in the morning, studying for exams while working on business plans for companies that didn't exist yet. That's when I started to understand something that Richard Whitmore and his ilk would never get. Hunger is a superpower. When you've been genuinely hungry, and I'm not talking about skipping lunch because you were busy, I'm talking about not knowing where your next meal is coming from. You develop a drive that can't be taught or bought or inherited. After graduation, I took every rejection letter from investment firms and consulting companies as proof that I was going to have to build my own path. Started Crosspoint Innovations with $12,000 I'd saved from working construction jobs during college breaks, and an idea that everyone said was too ambitious for someone without connections. Turns out, not having connections can be an advantage when you're trying to disrupt an industry that's built on old boys networks and inherited relationships. While my competitors were playing golf with their dad's business partners, I was working 18-hour days and learning from every mistake that didn't quite kill me. The whiskey was starting to do its job, smoothing out the sharp edges of memory and bringing everything into focus. Richard Whitmore looked at me and saw street garbage, but what he didn't understand was that garbage can be recycled, repurposed, transformed into something valuable. What he saw as my weakness, my background, my hunger, my willingness to fight for every scrap of respect, was actually the source of my strength. The beautiful thing about tonight's little performance at the Whitmore estate was that Richard had no idea what he'd just awakened. He thought he was putting me in my place, reminding me of the natural order of things. Instead, he just handed me the motivation I needed to show him exactly what someone with nothing left to lose could accomplish. I raised my glass to the glittering city spread out below me, to every person who'd ever counted me out, and to Richard Whitmore, who was about to learn that some people don't stay down when you try to step on them. Sometimes they get back up swinging. You know what's better than Christmas morning when you're 8 years old? Watching a financial empire start to crumble in real time while you sip perfectly brewed coffee from a mug that probably costs more than most people spend on groceries in a month. And let me tell you, this particular morning was shaping up to be the gift that kept on giving. I'd barely finished my first cup when the phone started ringing at 7:30 a.m. sharp. Now, most normal human beings don't appreciate getting woken up before 8 o'clock unless someone's either dead, dying, or about to make you very, very rich. But Margaret Whitmore, Clara's mother and the kind of woman who thinks early bird gets the worm applies to social damage control, had apparently decided that desperate times called for desperate measures. "Good morning, Margaret." I answered on the fourth ring, just long enough to let her stew in her own anxiety, but not long enough to seem completely unreasonable. "I'm an asshole, not a monster." "Oh, thank God you answered." Her voice had that particular quality that comes from spending half the night practicing what you're going to say and the other half wondering if you should just fake your own death and move to a nice island somewhere. "I don't suppose we could pretend last night was some sort of horrible misunderstanding?" I settled back into my kitchen chair and watched the sunrise paint Manhattan in shades of gold and possibility. Depends on which part you're referring to as the misunderstanding. The part where your husband called me street garbage, or the part where he did it in front of half of Connecticut's financial elite. Margaret made a sound like a balloon slowly leaking air. He'd had too much wine. You know how he gets when he's trying to impress potential investors. Sometimes his mouth moves faster than his brain. "Funny thing about that," I said, taking another sip of coffee. "I've noticed that alcohol tends to reveal what people really think rather than making them say things they don't mean. Kind of like a truth serum, but with more expensive bottles and fancier labels." The silence on the other end stretched out like taffy being pulled by a sadistic candy maker. Margaret Whitmore was a smart woman. She'd had to be, to survive 43 years of marriage to Richard without completely losing her mind or her sense of self-preservation. She knew exactly what her husband had done, and more importantly, she knew exactly what it was going to cost them. "What can we do to fix this?" she finally asked, and I had to give her credit for cutting straight to the chase. No more excuses, no more deflection, just a mother trying to clean up her husband's mess before it destroyed their daughter's marriage along with everything else. "That's an interesting question, Margaret. What makes you think it can be fixed?" Before she could answer, call waiting beeped, and the display showed a number I recognized. Evelyn Whitmorchin, Clara's sister and the black sheep of the family, mainly because she'd had the audacity to marry someone Richard considered ethnically questionable and moved to San Francisco to work for a tech startup instead of joining the family business. "Hold on, Margaret. I've got another call." I clicked over before she could protest. "Morning, Evelyn. Jesus Christ, what the hell happened last night?" Evelyn's voice crackled through the connection, probably calling from whatever coffee shop in the Mission District she'd made her unofficial office. "Mom's been blowing up my phone since 6 a.m., Clara sounds like she spent the night crying into a pillow, and Dad's locked himself in his study, refusing to talk to anyone. Your father decided to share his honest opinion about my background at dinner last night. I decided to share my honest opinion about our business relationship this morning. He called you garbage, didn't he? There was no surprise in her voice, just the weary resignation of someone who'd been watching her father's casual cruelty her whole life. God, I'm so sorry. I should have warned you that he gets extra shitty when he's nervous about money. Nervous about money? Evelyn paused, and I could practically hear the gears turning. Unlike the rest of her family, Evelyn had actually worked for her success, which meant she understood the value of information in ways that inherited wealth never teaches you. You didn't know? Whitmore Holdings has been hemorrhaging cash for the past 18 months. Bad investments, market volatility, some seriously questionable decisions by the board. The merger with your company wasn't just a good opportunity, it was a life preserver. Without it, she didn't need to finish the sentence. I was already connecting the dots, and the picture they formed was more beautiful than anything Picasso ever dreamed up. I clicked back over to Margaret. Sorry about that. You were asking what we could do to fix this situation. Yes, exactly. Whatever it takes. Richard is prepared to make a public apology, and of course there would be some sort of compensation for Margaret. I cut her off before she could really get rolling with the desperation. Let me ask you something. In all the years you've known your husband, how many times have you seen him apologize for anything? And I mean really apologize, not just say whatever words he thinks will make a problem go away. Another silence. This one lasted so long I started to wonder if the call had dropped. That's what I thought. I continued. So let's skip the part where we pretend Richard Whitmore is capable of genuine remorse and cut straight to the part where you tell me what you really want. I want my daughter to be happy, Margaret said quietly. Clara loves you. Whatever else is happening here, whatever business disputes or hurt feelings or whatever this is about, she doesn't deserve to get caught in the crossfire. And there it was, the first honest thing anyone in the Whitmore family had said to me in 3 years of marriage. I had to respect that, even if it didn't change what needed to happen next. You're right, I said. Clara doesn't deserve this. But here's the thing, Margaret, I didn't start this war. I'm just the only one with enough ammunition to finish it. Before she could respond, my other line rang again. This time it was Marcus, probably calling to update me on how spectacularly the morning was going from his end. I need to take this call, I told Margaret. But do me a favor. Tell Richard that if he wants to discuss terms for a ceasefire, he knows where to find me. I clicked over to Marcus before she could argue. Please tell me you have good news. Define good news, Marcus said, but I could hear the barely contained excitement in his voice. Because if by good news you mean the financial world is currently losing its collective shit over our little announcement, then yeah, we've got good news in spades. How bad is it? Bloomberg broke the story at 6:15 this morning. The Wall Street Journal followed up 30 minutes later with what can only be described as a hit piece on Whitmore Holdings' financial stability. And as of 15 minutes ago, Whitmore's stock price has dropped 12% and is still falling. I walked over to the window and looked out at the city waking up below. Somewhere out there, Richard Whitmore was probably staring at his own financial reports and realizing that his casual cruelty had just cost him more money than most people see in a lifetime. Any word from their board? Oh, it gets better. Gerald Morton, that's their CFO, called me directly about an hour ago. Apparently, there's an emergency board meeting scheduled for this afternoon, and the word panic was used at least 3 times in a 30-second conversation. I couldn't help but smile. And Fairmont Dynamics already reached out through intermediaries. Seems they've been watching Whitmore's troubles with great interest, and our sudden availability has opened up some very interesting possibilities. The beautiful thing about capitalism is how quickly loyalty evaporates when money gets involved. Whitmore Holdings board members weren't going to give 2 shits about Richard's hurt feelings when their own portfolios started bleeding red ink. Set up a meeting with Fairmont for tomorrow morning, I said. And Marcus? Make sure word gets back to Whitmore's people that we're taking other meetings. Nothing like a little competition to clarify priorities. Already on it. Oh, and boss, that Bloomberg reporter wants a follow-up interview this afternoon. Something about corporate culture clashes in modern mergers. Should I tell her you're available? I thought about Richard Whitmore sitting in his study, probably trying to figure out how 12 words spoken in anger had managed to detonate his entire financial empire. Tell her I'm very available. And Marcus? Make sure I look appropriately concerned about the impact on Whitmore's employees and shareholders. We're the reasonable party here, remember? Got it. Professional concern, measured disappointment, and just a hint of we try to make this work, but sometimes business relationships just aren't meant to be. Perfect. The king is bleeding, and the vultures are starting to circle. Time to find out if Richard Whitmore is as smart as he thinks he is. There's something deeply satisfying about watching a man who's spent his entire life looking down on people suddenly find himself staring up from the bottom of a hole he dug with his own mouth. And let me tell you, by 2 o'clock that afternoon, Richard Whitmore was neck-deep in shit and frantically trying to figure out which end of the shovel was supposed to help him climb out. I was in my office reviewing quarterly projections when Danielle, my assistant and the woman who'd been running interference between me and the outside world for the past decade, knocked on my door with the kind of expression usually reserved for delivering news about natural disasters or tax audits. "Your father-in-law is here," she announced, and the way she said father-in-law made it sound like a particularly unpleasant medical condition. "He's been sitting in the lobby for about 10 minutes now, demanding to see you. Security wanted to know if they should escort him out or let him continue making a scene." I leaned back in my chair and considered my options. On one hand, I could have Richard thrown out on his ass and savor the poetic justice of watching him get bounced from a building by security guards who probably made in a year what he spent on shoes. On the other hand, there was something to be said for letting him come upstairs and grovel in person. Sometimes you need to see the fear in someone's eyes to truly appreciate how completely the tables have turned. "How's he look?" I asked. Danielle grimaced, like someone who spent the night drinking whiskey and staring at financial reports. "His suit's wrinkled. His hair looks like he's been running his hands through it. And he's got that desperate look that rich people get when they realize money can't actually solve every problem." "Interesting. Let him sweat for another 30 minutes, then bring him up. But Danielle, make sure he knows he's being granted an audience, not demanding one." She nodded and turned to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I've never seen you this calm before making someone's day significantly worse. It's either really impressive or really terrifying. Why can't it be both?" After she left, I spent the next half hour deliberately not thinking about Richard Whitmore sitting in my lobby, probably checking his phone every 30 seconds to see if his stock price had stopped hemorrhaging. Instead, I focused on some contract revisions for a client in Seattle, responded to emails that had nothing to do with financial warfare, and generally went about my business like I didn't have a care in the world. Because the truth was, I didn't. For the first time in 3 years of being treated like Clara's charity case project, I held all the cards. And Richard Whitmore, the man who'd built his entire identity around controlling every situation he walked into, was about to learn what it felt like to be completely, utterly powerless. When Danielle finally brought him up, the transformation was remarkable. Gone was the imperious patriarch who'd presided over last night's dinner like some feudal lord dispensing judgment. In his place sat a man who looked like he'd aged about 5 years in the past 18 hours, his expensive suit hanging on him like he'd borrowed it from someone considerably more confident. His silver hair, usually slicked back with the kind of precision that suggested a team of stylists on retainer, was disheveled and showed traces of gray that expensive dye jobs usually managed to hide. His eyes, the same cold blue that had stared me down across his dining room table, now carried a desperate quality that reminded me of animals caught in traps they'd set for themselves. "Thank you for seeing me," he said, and even his voice sounded different. Smaller somehow, like someone had let half the air out of his ego and he was still trying to figure out how to reinflate it. I gestured to the chair across from my desk without getting up. "Power Dynamics 101. Make him come to you. Make him ask for what he wants. Make him work for every scrap of consideration. Richard, you're looking like someone who's had an interesting morning." He settled into the chair like a man trying not to spook a dangerous animal, his movements careful and deliberate in a way that suggested he was finally starting to understand the magnitude of his fuck-up. "I want to apologize," he began, and I held up a hand to stop him before he could really get rolling. "Let me save us both some time here, Richard. You're not sorry you said what you said. You're sorry it's going to cost you money. There's a difference." and we both know which category your regret falls into." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw a flash of the arrogant bastard who'd called me street garbage in front of half of Connecticut's elite. But desperation is a hell of a motivator, and he managed to swallow whatever comeback was trying to claw its way out of his throat. "I had too much to drink," he said instead. "The wine, the stress of the evening, trying to impress some potential investors who were there. It all got away from me." Ah yes, the drunk words are sober thought's defense. Classic. But here's the thing, Richard, I've seen you drunk before. I've watched you put away half a bottle of wine at family dinners and never once heard you call anyone else garbage. Funny how alcohol seems to specifically target whatever shreds of respect you might have had for me. He flinched like I'd slapped him, which was fair because I basically had. Sometimes the truth hurts more than any physical blow, especially when it strips away the comfortable lies people tell themselves about their own motivations. "What do you want?" he asked, dropping the pretense of contrition and cutting straight to the negotiation phase. At least he was being honest now about what this visit was really about. "That's an interesting question. What do I want from a man who publicly humiliated me in front of people whose respect I actually value? What do I want from someone who looked at me, his daughter's husband, the father of his future grandchildren, and decided I was something to be scraped off the bottom of his shoe?" I stood up and walked over to the window, partly for dramatic effect, and partly because I wanted him to have to crane his neck to look at me. Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the most weight. "You know what I realized last night, Richard? For 3 years, I've been trying to earn something from you that you were never going to give. Respect, acceptance, basic human decency. I kept thinking that if I just played the game well enough, if I proved myself successful enough, if I made Clara happy enough, eventually you'd look at me and see something other than an inconvenient reminder that your daughter chose love over status." I turned back to face him, and the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation was going to end. "But you can't give what you don't have, can you? And you can't respect what you don't understand. So here we are, you, sitting in my office, begging me to save a company you inherited but never really earned, and me, the street garbage who built his own empire from scratch, holding all the power." "The merger," he started. "The merger is dead," I said simply, killed by 12 words you couldn't resist saying out loud. "But here's the beautiful part, Richard, it doesn't matter anymore. Because while you were busy trying to put me in my place, I was busy building relationships with people who actually understand the value of partnership over patronization." His face went pale as the implications hit him. "You've already made other deals. Let's just say that Fairmont Dynamics has been very interested in our conversation. Amazing how quickly new opportunities open up when you're not wasting time with people who see you as a charity case." Richard Whitmore sat there in silence for a long moment, probably running calculations in his head and realizing that every number came out wrong. His empire was crumbling, his stock price was tanking, and the son-in-law he'd dismissed as street garbage was holding the only rope that might pull him out of the hole he dug. But some lessons can only be learned the hard way, and some prices can only be paid in full. You know what's harder than watching someone you love get hurt? Watching them finally realize they've been complicit in their own pain for years, and then having to decide whether they're brave enough to do something about it. That's the situation I walked into when I got back to my office after sending Richard Whitmore away with his tail between his legs and his empire crumbling around his ears. Clara was sitting in one of the leather chairs facing my desk, looking like she'd been through an emotional blender set on the soul-crushing Revelation setting. Her usually perfect blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was wearing jeans and a sweater instead of her usual designer armor, and her eyes had that red, swollen quality that comes from crying hard enough to dehydrate yourself. Danielle had thoughtfully provided a box of tissues and what looked like Clara's third cup of tea, because that's the kind of assistant who anticipates emotional meltdowns and stocks the office accordingly. She'd also probably been running interference with reporters, business partners, and whatever other vultures had started circling once word got out that the Whitmore empire was having a very public nervous breakdown. "How long have you been waiting?" I asked, settling into my chair and trying to gauge just how much of today's drama Clara had absorbed. The woman had spent her entire life insulated from the ugly realities of business warfare. So watching her father's company implode in real time was probably like discovering that Santa Claus was actually a loan shark with a gambling problem. About an hour, she said, and her voice had that hollow quality people get when they've cried themselves past the point of having any tears left. Danielle told me you were in a meeting with my father. How did that go? I studied her face, looking for any sign that she was here to plead Richard's case or try to convince me to play nice for the sake of family harmony. But what I saw instead was something I'd never seen before in 3 years of marriage. Clara Whitmore looking at the world with her eyes completely open, probably for the first time in her privileged life. About as well as you'd expect, I said carefully. Your father came here hoping to negotiate his way out of the hole he dug himself into last night. I explained that some things can't be fixed with handshake deals and good intentions. Clara nodded like she'd been expecting that answer. I talked to my mother this morning, and my sister, and about 6 different board members who somehow got hold of my personal phone number. She laughed, but it was the kind of bitter sound people make when they realize they've been living in a fantasy world. Funny how popular you become when your family's company is hemorrhaging money and everyone thinks you might have some influence over the situation. And do you? Have influence, I mean. She looked at me with those blue eyes that at first made me fall in love with her back in graduate school. Back when she was just Clara Morrison from Connecticut instead of Clara Whitmore, heiress to a financial empire built on inherited arrogance and casual cruelty. That's what I came here to find out, she said. But first, I need to tell you something that I should have said a long time ago. I leaned back in my chair and waited, because sometimes the most important conversations happen in the spaces between words, and Clara looked like she was gathering courage for something that had been building inside her for years. I've been ashamed, she said finally. Not of you, never of you, but of myself, for letting him treat you the way he has, for making excuses for his behavior, for pretending that if I just managed the situation carefully enough, I could somehow make everyone happy without anyone having to change or grow or acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, the way things have always been done isn't the way things should continue to be done. She stood up and walked over to the window, the same window where I'd stood an hour earlier, while Richard Whitmore sat in the exact chair she'd just vacated. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. Father and daughter, both coming to my office to reckon with the consequences of choices they'd made or failed to make. I grew up thinking that money solved problems, she continued, staring out at the Manhattan skyline like she was seeing it for the first time. That if you had enough of it, you could buy your way out of any uncomfortable situation. I watched my father write checks to make scandals disappear, donate to charities to offset bad publicity, hire the best lawyers and accountants and PR firms to manage whatever mess he'd created with his mouth or his ego. She turned back to face me, and I could see the weight of revelation in her expression. But you can't buy respect, can you? You can't purchase basic human decency or negotiate your way into being a better person. And you sure as hell can't write a check big enough to undo the damage of calling someone you're supposed to care about street garbage in front of a room full of people. No, I said quietly. You can't. Last night, when you left, I stood in that driveway, and I had to make a choice. I could go back inside and pretend this was just another one of my father's little episodes that we'd all laugh about eventually. Or I could finally admit that the man who raised me is a bully who's been using his wealth and position to hurt people for so long that he's forgotten there might be consequences. Clara came back to the chair and sat down, but this time she leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, like she was finally ready to have the kind of honest conversation we probably should have had years ago. I chose to admit the truth, she said. About him, about me, about the fact that I've been so afraid of losing my family that I was willing to let them slowly poison the man I love. And once I admitted that, I realized something else. I don't want to be a Whitmore anymore. I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of tension I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. What do you mean? I mean, I don't want to live in his shadow, or spend the rest of my life making excuses for his behavior, or pretend that my last name gives me some kind of moral authority when it's really just a reminder that I come from people who think money makes them better than everyone else. She reached into her purse and pulled out what looked like a business card, but when she handed it to me, I saw it was something else entirely. A resignation letter addressed to the board of directors of Whitmore Holdings, effective immediately. I quit, she said simply. Resigned from the board. terminated my consulting contract, told them to remove my name from the building directory and the company website. I don't want any part of what that place represents anymore. I looked at the letter, then back at Clara, trying to process what this meant. She'd just walked away from a trust fund worth more money than most small countries' GDP, from a position of power and influence that people spent their entire careers trying to achieve, from the safety net that had protected her from every possible consequence since the day she was born. What do you want to do instead? I asked. For the first time since I'd walked into the office, Clara smiled. A real smile, not the polite, practiced expression she wore to charity galas and board meetings. I want to build something with you, she said. Something that's ours, something that represents who we are instead of where we came from. I want to work for respect instead of inheriting it. And I want to do it without my father's money or his blessing or his name on the letterhead. I reached across the desk and took her hand, feeling the calluses she'd developed from the volunteer work she did at homeless shelters, the work she'd never told her father about because he would have considered it inappropriate for someone of her social position. The ballroom had transformed into something that meteorologists would classify as a Category 5 social disaster. You know those nature documentaries where they show hurricanes forming over warm ocean water? That's exactly what was happening, except instead of wind and rain, it was 300 people in formal were experiencing collective shock, outrage, and the kind of second-hand embarrassment that makes you want to crawl under a table and wait for civilization to reset itself. That I stayed on the mezzanine level, watching the chaos unfold below like I was observing some fascinating social experiment from a safe distance. Phones were everywhere, not the discreet, let me check my messages kind of phone usage, but the full-blown, holy shit, I need to document this for posterity variety. People were recording everything. The video still playing on the giant screen, Sloane's meltdown, Harold's attempts at damage control, and Geneva's increasingly frantic efforts to maintain some semblance of dignity while her carefully curated world collapsed in real time. The sound was incredible, like being inside a beehive that someone had just kicked down a hill. Conversations, arguments, shocked gasps, nervous laughter, and underneath it all, the distinctive hum of 300 people simultaneously trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Some guests were heading for the exits like the building was on fire. Others were clustering in groups to dissect every detail. And a few were actually trying to comfort my parents, who looked like they'd been hit by a truck made of pure confusion. Geneva was the first to attempt a counterattack, floating through the crowd in her lilac silk like a general trying to rally troops after a devastating surprise attack. "Please, everyone," she kept saying, her voice carrying that particular strain that comes from trying to sound calm while your entire social structure crumbles around you. There's obviously been some kind of misunderstanding. Perhaps we should all take a moment to, but nobody was listening to Geneva anymore. The video had spoken louder than any explanation she could possibly offer, and 300 people had just watched her daughter laughing about betraying the guy who was currently paying for their entertainment. Harold, meanwhile, was working a different angle. He cornered anyone who looked like they might have influence or media connections, his politician instincts kicking in as he tried to control the narrative before it escaped into the wild. "Family matter," I could hear him saying to a city councilman. "Private business that shouldn't have been made public. You understand how these things can be taken out of context." Out of context, right? Because apparently, there's some magical context where your daughter, your future son-in-law's best friend, and an ex-boyfriend tangled up in a hotel bed becomes a heartwarming story about family values. That's when Sloane decided to try the direct approach. She gathered up her $10,000 worth of white silk and designer craftsmanship and stormed toward the mezzanine stairs like she was leading a charge into battle. The train of her dress swept behind her with the kind of dramatic flair that would have been impressive if she wasn't currently starring in her own public humiliation. "Adrian," she shouted as she climbed the stairs, her voice cutting through the ballroom noise like a fire alarm. "We need to talk. Right now." I waited until she reached the mezzanine level, mainly because I was curious to see what her opening move would be. Would she go with denial? Emotional manipulation? Righteous indignation? The suspense was killing me. She chose righteous indignation, which was honestly the most predictable option, but also the most entertaining. "How dare you embarrass me like this?" she hissed, getting close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with what I was pretty sure was cologne that didn't belong to me. In front of everyone. In front of my family. This is insane. You're right, I said calmly. It is insane. What you did was insane. Recording it was just good documentation. You had no right to spy on me. Actually, I had every right to investigate when my gut started screaming that something was wrong. Turns out, my gut has better judgment than I do. She tried a different tactic, her voice dropping to that soft, pleading tone that used to make me want to fix whatever was wrong. Adrian, please. One mistake. One stupid moment. Don't throw away everything we've built together. Everything we built. I laughed, and it came out sharper than I'd intended. Sloan, I built this. I paid for this. I organized this. You just showed up and looked pretty while I handled everything else. And apparently, while I was building our life, you were building a completely different life with other people. That's when Harold decided to join our little mezzanine conference, bringing Geneva along for moral support and additional outrage. They climbed those stairs like they were ascending to their own execution, which, in terms of their social standing, they probably were. Adrian, Harold said, and his voice had that particular quality that politicians use when they're trying to sound reasonable while threatening you. We need to have a private conversation. This whole situation has gotten completely out of hand. Every conversation was private until last night. I replied, looking directly at him. That was kind of the problem. Geneva tried her own version of damage control, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that suggested she thought I was having some kind of mental breakdown that could be managed with the right combination of patience and sedatives. Darling, you're obviously upset, and rightfully so. But this isn't the way to handle family matters. Perhaps we could all sit down somewhere quiet and discuss this like civilized people. Civilized people don't cheat on their fiancés with their best friends and exes. I said, civilized people don't plan weddings while planning betrayals. Civilized people don't make other people pay for parties celebrating lies. Sloan tried one more approach, reaching for my hand like physical contact might somehow reset our entire relationship. Adrian, we loved each other. We did. Maybe I made a mistake, but what we had was real. I looked down at her hand on mine, the same hand that had been doing God knows what in room 1119 a few hours earlier, and gently pulled away. I loved us, I said quietly. You loved attention. There's a difference. That's when the shouting started in earnest. Harold demanding compensation for the damage to the family's reputation. Geneva insisting that I was destroying innocent people with my vindictive behavior. Sloan cycling through every emotional manipulation technique in the book, from tears to anger to promises to threats. But I kept my voice low, steady, and boring. Because paperwork beats drama every time, and I had all the paperwork on my side. Check your contracts, I told Harold when he started threatening legal action. Check the addendums you signed. Check the insurance clauses and the vendor agreements. Everything I did today was legal, documented, and entirely within my rights as the primary account holder on every single financial instrument involved in this event. Harold went pale as he realized what that meant. All those times he'd insisted on being involved in vendor relationships. All those signatures he'd added to contracts to ensure the Whitmore name was associated with every detail. He'd just made himself financially responsible for a wedding that was never going to happen. You can't do this, Geneva whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. I already did it, I replied. About 20 minutes ago. The beautiful thing about the whole situation was how clean it was. No theft, no vandalism, no assault charges or restraining orders. Just a systematic unwinding of financial obligations and contractual relationships, executed with the kind of precision that comes from actually reading the fine print instead of just trusting people to do the right thing. That I walked toward the mezzanine stairs, leaving them standing there in their formal wear and their shock, processing the reality that their carefully orchestrated social event had just become their very expensive problem. Where are you going? Sloan called after me. Home, I said without turning around. To pack your things. The last thing I heard as I descended those stairs was Geneva asking Harold in a voice like broken glass, how much is this going to cost us? I didn't stick around to hear his answer. I had boxes to pack and a door to close. You'd think that after publicly detonating someone's life in front of 300 witnesses, you'd get at least one quiet morning to drink coffee and contemplate the philosophical implications of justice. But apparently, when you systematically dismantle a Whitmore family production, they don't just sulk quietly in their mansion and accept defeat. No, they show up at your apartment at 8 a.m. like a well-dressed collection agency with trust fund backing and generational entitlement issues. The pounding on my door started before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee, which was honestly just rude. I'd been awake since 5, sitting on my couch in yesterday's clothes, staring at the boxes I'd packed the night before, all of Sloane's belongings, labeled with the kind of obsessive organization that happens when you're running on adrenaline and the need to never see this person's stuff again, that I opened the door to find the full Whitmore delegation. Harold looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight, Geneva clutching a leather portfolio like it contained state secrets, and Sloane wearing designer athleisure that probably cost more than most people's rent. They looked like they'd been up all night plotting strategy, which, knowing them, they probably had. "Adrian," Harold said, pushing past me into my apartment like he owned the place. "We need to discuss compensation." Compensation. The man had balls, I'd give him that. His daughter had been caught cheating on camera. His family's social standing was currently circulating on social media like a viral dance trend, and he wanted to talk about compensation. "Good morning to you too, Harold," I said, closing the door behind them. "Coffee? Aspirin? Reality check." Geneva was already surveying my apartment with the kind of disdain usually reserved for crime scenes or modern art installations. "Adrian, darling, this whole situation has gotten completely out of hand. The phone calls, the social media posts, the rumors, it's simply devastating to the family's reputation. Your daughter's reputation was devastated the moment she decided to turn our hotel block into her personal playground," I replied. "I just provided the documentation." Harold pulled out what looked like a calculator and a stack of receipts that could have choked a horse. "At least 50,000, he announced like he was reading a grocery list. "That's what yesterday's disaster cost us in vendor penalties, transportation fees, and reputation management." I almost laughed. Actually, I did laugh. 50,000? Harold, let me introduce you to a beautiful concept called consequences. It's what happens when your actions have results you don't like. "You deliberately sabotaged our event," Geneva said, her voice taking on that particular pitch that happens when rich people realize their money can't actually fix everything. "You cost us relationships with vendors, embarrassed us in front of our friends, and created a public relations nightmare that's going to follow us for years." "I cost you." I set down my coffee and pulled out my own folder, the one I'd prepared the night before while packing boxes. "Let me refresh your memory about who actually paid for what." I laid out the contracts on my coffee table like I was dealing cards at a casino. Venue final payment, my credit card. Transportation coordination, my account. Vendor relationships, addendums with your signatures taking financial responsibility for all upgrades and modifications. Insurance policies, beneficiary clauses that automatically void in case of documented infidelity. Harold went pale as he recognized his own signature on document after document. All those times he'd insisted on being involved, on adding his name to vendor relationships, on upgrading everything to reflect the Whitmore standard, he'd been signing himself up to inherit the bill when things went sideways. "This is extortion," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "This is contract law." I corrected. "You wanted control over every detail, so you got control over every consequence." "Congratulations." That's when Sloane decided to try the emotional approach, because apparently, she thought 24 hours was enough time for me to forget what I'd seen in room 1119. "Adrian, we loved each other," she said, and her voice had that practiced quality that suggested she'd been rehearsing this speech. "What happened yesterday? It was complicated. There were feelings involved that I didn't know how to handle. But what we had was real. We loved each other." I repeated slowly, like I was testing the words for accuracy. That's an interesting way to phrase it. Past tense. Like something that happened once upon a time before reality set in. "Don't be cruel," she whispered, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. Professional-grade tears that would have been impressive if I hadn't spent the last 6 months watching her perform for various audiences. "I'm not being cruel," I said gently. "I'm being accurate. I loved us. You loved the idea of us, the social status of us, the financial security of us. But you also loved whatever was happening in that hotel room. and you can't love both without destroying one of them. It was a mistake, she said, and now the tears were real. One stupid mistake that I'll regret for the rest of my life. 3 people don't make one mistake, I replied. 3 people make a choice, and choices have consequences. Harold tried to regain control of the conversation by returning to his favorite topic, money. Regardless of the emotional aspects, there are practical matters to consider. The vendors are demanding payment for services that were rendered. The venue is threatening legal action over the disruption. Our insurance company is asking questions about liability. Your insurance company, I corrected. Your vendors. Your legal problems. I fulfilled my obligations under every contract I signed. You're the ones who signed addendums taking responsibility for everything else. I pulled out another folder, this one containing copies of every email I'd sent the day before. I notified all relevant parties that I was withdrawing from the event due to personal circumstances, and that all future coordination should be directed to the Whitmore family per our signed agreements. Everything was handled professionally and according to the terms you insisted on. Geneva was reading over the contracts with the expression of someone discovering that their parachute had been replaced with a decorative handkerchief. These clauses. Harold, did you read these clauses? Of course I read them, he snapped, but his voice suggested he was realizing he maybe should have read them more carefully. The responsibility transfer is automatic, I explained helpfully. The moment I executed my withdrawal rights, all remaining obligations shifted to the secondary signatories. That would be you. I stood up and walked to the pile of boxes I'd packed the night before. Speaking of obligations, these are Sloane's belongings. Everything's been cleaned, folded, and organized. You'll find inventory lists in each box because I believe in proper documentation. Sloane stared at the boxes like they represented the death of every hope she'd ever had. You're really doing this. You're really throwing away everything we built together. I'm not throwing it away, I said quietly. I'm returning it to its rightful owner. You built something, Sloane. Just not with me. I helped them carry the boxes to Harold's car, because despite everything, I was raised to be polite, and watched them load up the physical remnants of our relationship with the efficiency of a moving company. Before they left, Harold made one last attempt at damage control. This isn't over, Adrian. We have resources, we have influence, and we have lawyers. Don't think you can just walk away from this without consequences. Influence fumbles when truth has a timestamp, I replied. And lawyers cost money. How much money do you have left after yesterday's bills come due? They drove away without answering, which was probably answer enough that I went back inside, made fresh coffee, and sat down to write a brief note to the dozen or so wedding guests who'd reached out asking for my side of the story. No details beyond what you saw. I wish everyone well. Then I blocked Rafi's number, blocked Julian's social media accounts, and deleted every contact that connected me to the life I'd been living for the past 2 years. Silence, it turned out, was the heaviest door I'd ever closed, but it was also the only one that stayed shut. Time has this weird way of smoothing over even the sharpest edges, like ocean waves gradually turning broken glass into sea glass, still recognizable as something that was once jagged, but now just smooth enough to hold without bleeding. 6 months after what the local social media circles had dubbed the wedding that wasn't, life had settled into something that felt almost normal, assuming your definition of normal includes being locally famous for the most spectacular relationship implosion in recent memory. The weeks immediately following the ballroom disaster had been interesting, and by interesting, I mean the kind of exhausting that makes you understand why some people just disappear to cabins in Montana and become hermits who communicate exclusively through cryptic Facebook posts about organic farming. Everyone had opinions about what I'd done, and apparently, everyone felt compelled to share those opinions with me, whether I'd asked for them or not. Some people said I was cruel. These were usually folks who thought that public humiliation was a worse crime than betrayal, the kind of people who would rather suffer in silence than make anyone uncomfortable with messy truths. They'd corner me at the grocery store or the gym, shaking their heads sadly while explaining that there were better ways to handle the situation and some things should be kept private. What they really meant was that I should have quietly broken up with Sloane, let the Whitmores save face, and allowed everyone to maintain their comfortable illusions about how the world worked. The fact that this approach would have left me financially ruined and emotionally destroyed while my ex-fiancé and former best friend rode off into the sunset seemed irrelevant to these particular moral philosophers. Others said I was brave. These were the people who'd been cheated on themselves, or who'd watched friends get systematically destroyed by partners who thought loyalty was optional. They'd buy me drinks and share their own war stories, treating me like some kind of folk hero who'd finally given cheaters the public reckoning they deserved. "You did what we all wish we'd had the balls to do," became a common refrain, usually delivered with the kind of intensity that suggested some serious, unresolved trauma, but most people just moved on to new drama, because that's what people do. Clara's hand fits perfectly in mine, her wedding ring catching the afternoon sunlight and throwing little rainbows across the sand. We decided to renew our vows, not because the first ones didn't count, but because we were different people now than we'd been 3 years ago when we'd gotten married in that ridiculous cathedral ceremony that cost more than most people's houses and felt about as personal as a corporate merger. This time, it's just us, a justice of the peace who doubles as a surf instructor, and maybe 20 people who actually give a damn about our happiness instead of our net worth. No crystal chandeliers, no 5-course meals that cost more per plate than a decent used car, no guest list carefully curated to impress business associates and social climbers. Just love, built on a foundation of trust and mutual respect instead of family expectations and financial convenience. "You clean up pretty nice for street garbage," Clara says, adjusting my tie with that smile that first made me fall in love with her back when we were both graduate students who thought ramen noodles were a legitimate food group. "You're not looking too shabby yourself for someone who walked away from a trust fund that could have bought a small country," I reply, because even on our wedding day, we can't resist the kind of sarcasm that got us through the past 6 months of rebuilding our lives from scratch. The transformation has been remarkable, and I'm not just talking about the way Clara looks, though trading designer dresses for sundresses and expensive jewelry for the simple gold band on her finger has definitely been an upgrade. I'm talking about the way she carries herself now, the confidence that comes from earning your own paycheck instead of living off daddy's money. She started working for Crosspoint 3 months ago as Director of Strategic Development, a fancy title that basically means she helps me figure out which companies are worth acquiring and which ones are just elaborate money laundering schemes disguised as legitimate businesses. Turns out, growing up around corporate dysfunction gives you a pretty good radar for spotting it in other organizations. The work suits her. She's got her father's head for numbers and her mother's ability to read people, but without the casual cruelty that made Richard such a spectacular failure as a human being. Watching her negotiate deals with investment firms and tech startups has been like watching someone discover they have superpowers they never knew they possessed. "Any word from your father lately?" I ask, because even on the happiest day in recent memory, Richard Whitmore's ghost still haunts the edges of our conversation like a bad smell that won't quite fade. Clara's expression shifts slightly, the way it always does when someone mentions the man who used to control every aspect of her life. Not sadness, exactly, but something closer to the feeling you get when you remember a nightmare that seemed real until you woke up. He's in Palm Beach now, apparently, living in some condo development that caters to distinguished gentlemen of a certain age, she says, making air quotes around the phrase like she's handling something distasteful with tongs. Mom says he's trying to start a consulting firm that helps family businesses navigate succession planning, which is either the most ironic career choice in history or the most delusional. I can picture it perfectly. Richard Whitmore, the man who destroyed his own family business through sheer arrogance and poor impulse control, trying to advise other families on how to avoid making the same mistakes he made. It's like a pyromaniac opening a fire safety consulting company. Any takers? Would you hire a consultant whose last job ended with his own board of directors voting him out of the company he inherited from his father? Clara shakes her head. He's burning through what's left of his savings pretty quickly, from what I hear. Turns out that maintaining a lifestyle built for someone with unlimited access to corporate funds gets expensive when you're paying for it with your own money. The beautiful thing about Richard's downfall isn't that it happened. Bullies eventually always get their comeuppance, one way or another. The beautiful thing is how completely and thoroughly he engineered his own destruction. Every bridge he burned, every relationship he poisoned with his casual cruelty, every person he dismissed as beneath his notice, All of it came back to haunt him when he needed those connections most. Meanwhile, the company he'd nearly destroyed through his incompetence and arrogance was thriving under new management. Elizabeth Chun had turned out to be exactly the kind of leader Richard never was. Someone who understood that businesses succeed when they're built on mutual respect and shared goals instead of fear and intimidation. The acquisition had gone through faster than anyone expected, partly because Elizabeth was eager to move forward and partly because Richard's former board members were so desperate to distance themselves from his toxic leadership that they practically threw money at us to make the deal happen. What had once been Whitmore Holdings was now a subsidiary of Crosspoint Innovations, renamed Crosspoint Strategic Development, and staffed with people who actually knew how to treat their colleagues like human beings. Do you ever miss it? I asked Clara as we watched the sun start its slow descent toward the horizon. The money, the status, the ability to buy whatever you wanted without checking your bank account first. She considers the question seriously, the way she always does when I ask her something that matters. It's one of the things I love about her. She never gives easy answers to complicated questions. I miss the security, she says finally. Not the money itself, but the feeling that no matter what happened, there would always be enough. That if I made a mistake or got sick or just needed help, there would be resources available to fix whatever was wrong. And now I have something better than financial security, she says, squeezing my hand. I have the knowledge that I can take care of myself, that I'm strong enough to build something from nothing, and that the person I chose to build it with chose me for who I am instead of what I inherit. The waves roll in and out with the kind of rhythm that makes you understand why people have been coming to the ocean to think about life since humans first figured out how to walk upright. There's something hypnotic about all that water moving according to forces much bigger and older than any human drama. You know what the funny thing is? Clara continues, staring out at the horizon where the sky meets the water in a perfect line that seems to stretch on forever. My father spent his entire life trying to build an empire that would outlast him, something that would carry the Whitmore name forward for generations. He was obsessed with legacy, with being remembered as someone who mattered. And instead, he'll be remembered as a cautionary tale about what happens when you confuse wealth with worth, when you mistake fear for respect, when you think calling someone street garbage at a dinner party is an acceptable way to assert your dominance. I think about that night 6 months ago, sitting in Richard's dining room while he delivered what he thought was a killing blow to my dignity. How he'd looked around that table full of sycophants and social climbers, savoring what he assumed would be my humiliation and his own demonstration of power. He had no way of knowing that those 12 words would cost him everything he'd spent his life building. No way of understanding that empires built on arrogance and inherited privilege are actually incredibly fragile things, held together by nothing more substantial than the fear and greed of the people who benefit from them. Empires fall with a whisper, I say, repeating the thought that occurred to me that night as I watched Richard destroy his own future with casual cruelty. Clara looks at me with that expression she gets when she realizes I've been thinking about something deeper than whatever we've been talking about on the surface. Is that what you were? She asks. A whisper. I consider the question as the sun continues its descent and the beach gradually empties of everyone except the die-hard surfers and the couples taking romantic walks along the water's edge. A whisper, something so quiet you might not even notice it at first, but persistent enough to eventually be heard by everyone who matters. I think I was the whisper of truth, I say finally. The reminder that respect can't be bought or inherited, that real power comes from what you build rather than what you inherit, and that sometimes the people you look down on are the ones with the strength to tear down everything you think you own. Clara smiles and leans against my shoulder, both of us watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and gold that no amount of money could ever purchase. I love you, she says simply, and those 3 words carry more weight than any fortune her father could have left her. I love you too, I reply, and mean it more than I've ever meant anything in my life. Somewhere out there, in a condo development in Palm Beach, Richard Whitmore is probably sitting alone, wondering how 12 words spoken in anger managed to destroy everything he thought he'd built to last forever. But that's his story to figure out. This is ours.